My billionaire father grabbed the microphone at my wedding reception to publicly disown me for marrying a poor coding teacher. He told the entire ballroom of Atlanta elite that I was cut off from the family trust forever. My new husband simply smiled, took the microphone from his hand, and told him we did not need a single dime of his money. 6 months later, my parents completely froze when they realized exactly who the man I married actually was. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your worth and tried to control your life. I am Kiara. I am 35 years old and I work as a financial strategist. I stood at the center of the grand ballroom in my custom white gown, holding the hand of my husband Andre. The room was absolutely breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over tables draped in heavy silk. Hundreds of guests filled the space, representing the absolute pinnacle of the city elite. Corporate executives, politicians, and socialites sat eating expensive catered meals. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the ultimate stage for my family to execute their final punishment. My father, Reginald, stood up from the head table. He is a self-made billionaire, the ruthless chief executive officer of a massive logistics empire. He tapped his crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon. The sharp chiming sound cut through the gentle hum of conversation and the soft jazz playing in the background. The entire ballroom fell completely silent. Everyone turned their attention to the man who commanded every room he ever entered. I squeezed Andre's hand, feeling a sudden knot of anxiety form in my stomach. I knew my father. I knew the cold, hard look in his eyes. This was not the look of a proud parent ready to give away his daughter. This was the look of a corporate titan preparing to terminate a bad investment. He adjusted his custom-tailored suit jacket and grabbed the microphone. He looked directly at me, his expression devoid of any warmth or paternal affection. He did not start with a joke or a fond memory from my childhood. He started with an indictment. He told the silent crowd that he had spent his entire life building an empire from the ground up, expecting his children to respect the legacy of Black excellence he had forged. He said that a legacy is only as strong as the alliances it builds. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger right at Andre. He told the hundreds of watching guests that I had deliberately chosen to spit on our family legacy by marrying a man with no ambition, no capital, and no future. He called my husband a broke community center coding teacher who was only looking for a free ride on the family wealth. I did not cry. I had been bracing for this exact moment my entire life. I stood there feeling the collective shock of the room washing over me. I remembered all the grueling years I spent working 80-hour weeks as a financial strategist, trying to prove my worth to a man who only saw me as a corporate asset. I remembered the endless boardroom meetings where he would demand I marry a vice president of a rival logistics firm just to secure a corporate merger. I had built my own career, securing massive returns for my clients, using my own sharp instincts, while he constantly undermined me. He wanted me to be a pawn in his chess game. Because I chose love and genuine connection with Andre over a calculated business transaction, my father decided to make an example out of me. Reginald gripped the microphone tighter, his voice booming through the speakers. He announced formally and coldly that effective immediately, I was officially cut out of the family trust. He declared that I would not receive a single penny of the inheritance. He stated that my access to all family resources, properties, and accounts was permanently revoked. He wanted to make sure everyone in our social circle knew that I was discarded. He wanted to ensure that no one in that room would ever do business with me again for fear of crossing him. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. I could hear people shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Then my mother Vivian stood up from her chair at the head table. She smoothed down the front of her shimmering designer gown, making sure all eyes shifted to her. Vivian was the ultimate image-obsessed matriarch. She lived for societal approval and weaponized her conditional love whenever we stepped out of line. She took the microphone from my father, giving the crowd a practiced look of deep maternal sorrow. She loudly apologized to the horrified guests for putting them through this uncomfortable scene. She lamented my tragic downfall, telling everyone that they had tried so hard to raise me with proper values. She actually gestured towards my younger sister Jasmine, who was sitting in the front row. Vivian told the crowd that they should look to Jasmine as the true standard of the family. She praised Jasmine for making a perfect union, for understanding duty, and for marrying a man of real substance. Jasmine was 32 years old and the undisputed golden child of the family. She sat at the VIP table wearing a smug, satisfied smirk. She had strictly followed our parents' playbook her entire life, never stepping out of line, never questioning their toxic demands. Next to her sat her husband, Preston. Preston was a 34-year-old hedge fund heir, a white man born into extreme wealth who never had to work a day for anything he owned. He possessed an arrogance that radiated from him like a foul scent. As my mother praised their marriage, Preston threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a mocking, cruel sound that echoed in the silent room. He ostentatiously lifted his wrist, checking the time on his $5,000 luxury watch, acting completely bored by my public humiliation. He leaned over and whispered something into Jasmine's ear, making her giggle behind her champagne flute. I stood frozen at the sweetheart table. The betrayal was total and absolute. My mother was standing in front of my friends, my colleagues, and my new husband, pretending that she was the victim of my terrible choices. She told the room that she hoped someday I would wake up from this delusion and realize the terrible mistake I had made by throwing away my privileged life for a man who could not even afford to buy me a decent diamond. She handed the microphone back to Reginald, playing the part of the exhausted, heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. Reginald did not even look at me when he delivered his final blow. He signaled the private security team standing at the perimeter of the ballroom. He spoke into the microphone one last time, telling the guards to escort the newlyweds out of the building. He was throwing us out of our own wedding reception, a reception I had partially paid for with my own hard-earned savings. The security guards, tall men in dark suits, began marching down the center aisle toward the sweetheart table. The tension in the room reached a breaking point. I felt a hot wave of anger rising in my chest, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I refused to scream or beg or plead for my place in a family that viewed me as a disposable business transaction. I took a deep breath, ready to turn and walk away under my own power. Before the security guards could even reach the edge of the dance floor, Andre moved. He did not shout. He did not look intimidated. My husband, who had been quietly holding my hand this entire time, stepped forward with a calm, chilling composure that I had never seen before. He radiated a quiet authority that stopped the approaching security guards right in their tracks. The guards hesitated, looking between Andre and my father, unsure of how to proceed. Andre reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from my father's hand. Reginald was so shocked by the sheer confidence of the gesture that he actually let it go. Andre stood tall, adjusting his bespoke tuxedo jacket. He looked out at the sea of shocked faces, then turned his gaze to my parents. His deep, smooth voice filled the vast ballroom, carrying no anger, no fear, and no desperation. "Keep your money, Reginald. We do not need it." Those 9 words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Andre smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that seemed to infuriate my father more than any insult ever could. Andre did not try to defend his profession. He did not try to argue with my mother about his worth. He simply rejected their entire world with total indifference. He looked over at Preston, who had stopped laughing and was now glaring at us. Andre gave him a polite nod before turning his attention entirely back to me. He wrapped his arm protectively around my waist and guided me away from the sweetheart table. We did not run. We did not rush. We walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with absolute dignity. My head was held high. I looked straight ahead, ignoring the whispers and the staring eyes of the people who were supposed to be celebrating our union. The doors of the grand ballroom swung open, and we stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the toxic poison of my family behind us. A sleek, black luxury SUV was waiting for us at the curb. The driver immediately opened the door. We climbed into the quiet, leather-scented interior, and the heavy doors closed, shutting out the noise of the hotel. I let out a long breath, leaning back against the seat. I felt incredibly light, as if a massive chain had just been severed from my neck. I looked at Andre, feeling a rush of overwhelming love for this man who had stood by me and faced down a billionaire without blinking an eye. I am so sorry they ruined our day, I whispered, resting my head on his shoulder. Andre chuckled softly, wrapping his arm around me. They did not ruin anything beautiful, he said. They just sped up the timeline. I sat up slightly confused by his words. What timeline? I asked. Andre reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a sleek, heavy black envelope sealed with a silver wax stamp. He held it out to me, his expression shifting from the gentle husband I knew to something intensely focused and razor-sharp. I did not want to ruin your day with business, he said quietly, his voice dropping to a low, steady murmur. But since your father brought it up, you should open it. I took the envelope from his hands. The paper was thick and expensive. My heart began to race as I broke the silver seal. I pulled out a stack of folded documents. The logo at the top belonged to one of the largest, most aggressive venture capital and tech acquisition firms in the world. I stared at the papers, my analytical mind struggling to comprehend what I was looking at. The documents were articles of incorporation, acquisition portfolios, and banking summaries showing numbers so massive. They made my father logistics empire look like a corner store. I looked up at Andre, completely stunned. What is this? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Andre smiled, leaning back against the leather seat as the SUV merged onto the highway. That is my day job, he said simply. I teach coding at the community center because I want to give back to the kids in our neighborhood. But that company in your hands, I built it from the ground up. My mind was spinning. The man I had married, the modest teacher my family had just publicly humiliated for being poor, was the stealth founder and chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar venture capital firm. He had kept his wealth completely hidden, using a board of proxies to conduct his acquisitions because he wanted a life partner who loved him for his heart, not his portfolio. He wanted to be certain that the woman he married would stand by him when everyone else told her he was worthless. I looked down at the documents again, my eyes scanning the massive acquisition portfolios. Then a very specific detail caught my attention, a detail that made my financial strategist's brain kick into high gear. I saw the name of a holding company that I recognized perfectly. It was one of the shadow entities my father used to manage his corporate debts. Andre watched my face as the realization hit me. I looked back up at him, the shock slowly transforming into a sharp, brilliant clarity. My family had just thrown away everything to protect their financial reputation, completely unaware that the man they had just kicked out of the building held the key to their entire corporate survival in the palm of his hand. The car sped through the Atlanta night, carrying us toward a reality my family could not possibly fathom. The war had just begun, and for the first time in my life, I was holding the ultimate trump card. We spent the next 2 weeks in a quiet coastal town in Mexico. There were no luxury yachts, no five-star resort parades, and no society photographers. We just rented a small private villa right by the water. It was the most profound peace I had felt in my entire life. We spent our days walking along the beach and our nights strategizing in the warm ocean breeze. Andre gave me the time and space I needed to process the massive revelation of his true identity. We agreed to keep his billionaire status a complete secret for now. We needed to see exactly how far my father would go to break me. I wanted to witness the full extent of Reginald's ruthless nature when he thought I had absolutely nothing left to my name. I knew my father operated like a machine without empathy or hesitation, but I needed to see his playbook with my own eyes. The harsh reality check hit the exact moment our flight landed back in Atlanta. We took a standard ride share from the airport to my downtown condo. I had lived in that luxury building for 7 years. I decorated every single square inch of that space myself, using my own design choices. I paid the exorbitant monthly maintenance fees, straight from my own salary. But there was a catch that I had always ignored. When I first moved in, my father insisted on structuring the property deed through one of his corporate shell companies. He claimed it was a necessary move for tax purposes and to protect my personal assets from liabilities. My financial strategist brain knew it was a control tactic, but back then I was still trying to be the perfect obedient daughter. I signed the paperwork believing my father would never actually weaponize my own home against me. I was foolish to think family loyalty outweighed corporate leverage in his mind. We dragged our suitcases through the heavy revolving glass doors of the lobby. The pristine marble floors gleamed under the modern geometric chandeliers. Usually, the head concierge David would greet me with a bright, warm smile and ask about my day. He knew my coffee order and my work schedule. Today, David looked up from his mahogany desk, saw me walking in, and immediately dropped his gaze. He stared hard at his computer screen, his jaw tight and his shoulders rigid. The two security guards stationed near the elevators suddenly shifted their weight, looking at the ceiling, the floor, anywhere but at us. A strange, heavy, and suffocating silence settled over the entire lobby. I ignored the incredibly toxic atmosphere and guided Andre toward the private resident elevators. We rode up to the 30th floor in total silence. I felt a sharp knot of anxiety forming in my stomach, but I pushed it down, masking my emotions behind a blank professional expression. We stepped out into the softly lit carpeted hallway and walked to my front door. I pulled my sleek silver keycard from my purse and tapped it against the digital lock pad. A harsh red light flashed across the sensor. The lock buzzed a sharp, aggressive tone of denial. I frowned and wiped the magnetic strip on my jacket, thinking the card was just dirty from travel. I tapped it against the sensor again. The red light flashed. The buzzer sounded. Before I could try a third time, the elevator doors chimed open at the end of the hallway behind us. David stepped out, accompanied by the building manager and a senior security guard. David looked physically ill. His hands actually trembled as he held a thick manila folder against his chest. I turned around, dropping my hand from my front door handle. The atmosphere shifted from awkward to openly hostile. The building manager stepped forward, clearing his throat nervously. He did not look me in the eye when he spoke. He handed me the manila folder and mumbled that he was incredibly sorry, but he was just following direct orders from the property ownership group. I opened the heavy folder. Inside rested a formal legal eviction notice and a court-mandated trespassing order barring me from entering the premises. The paperwork was filed and executed while Andre and I were completely out of the country. My father had not waited a single day. He moved to strip me of my shelter the very second the wedding reception ended. He authorized his shell company to change the locks, pack up my life, and treat me like a squatter in the home I had paid for. I handed the legal papers to Andre. A cold, calculating calm washed over my entire body. If Reginald wanted to play a game of corporate warfare, I knew the exact rules of engagement. I pulled out my phone and immediately opened my primary banking app. I typed in my secure password. The screen loaded for a split second before flashing a stark error message stating my access credentials had been permanently revoked. I closed the app and switched to my massive investment portfolio. The accounts I had built with my own corporate bonuses. The accounts my father insisted on co-signing when I first started my career as a safety net were completely zeroed out. The funds were legally frozen and transferred into a family trust holding account that required Reginald's signature to release. I checked my secondary checking account, my emergency credit cards, and my business expense accounts. Every single one was locked, suspended, or reported closed. He had initiated a total financial execution. He wiped out my liquid assets, my savings, and my credit score in one coordinated strike. The financial cutoff was absolute and completely ruthless. My father wanted to starve me out. He calculated that a few days of homelessness and hunger would completely break my spirit. He expected me to show up at his corporate headquarters, crying and begging for my old privileged life back. He wanted me to divorce Andre, drop to my knees, and submit to his absolute control just to get a roof over my head. He wanted to prove to the entire city of Atlanta that without his money and his powerful name, I was absolutely nothing but a helpless failure. I locked my phone screen and slid the device back into my purse. I looked at Andre, expecting him to look worried or overwhelmed by the sheer brutality of my family. Instead, he was reading the eviction notice with a calm, detached, and almost amused expression. He did not look like a man whose wife had just lost everything. He looked like an apex predator observing a very foolish piece of prey walking straight into a trap. He handed the manila folder back to the nervous building manager and gave him a polite nod, acknowledging that the manager was just a pawn in my father game. Before the building manager could even turn away to retreat behind his desk, the heavy frosted glass doors of the private resident lounge swung open. The sharp, distinctive click of designer heels echoed across the pristine marble floor. I did not even need to turn my head to know who was walking toward us. The scent of an overpowering, expensive floral perfume hit the air a second before my younger sister spoke. Well, look who finally made it back to reality. Jasmine strolled into the center of the lobby, holding a half-empty martini glass. She wore a smug, deeply satisfied smirk that twisted her perfectly contoured face into something ugly. Preston trailed closely behind her with his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks. They had been sitting in the exclusive VIP lounge this entire time, sipping top-shelf liquor, just waiting to watch my public execution unfold. My father had orchestrated the eviction, but Jasmine had clearly volunteered to be the executioner. Jasmine snapped her fingers at one of the security guards. The man looked incredibly uncomfortable, but he obeyed her command. He awkwardly dragged a cheap, thin black plastic garbage bag out from behind the concierge desk and dropped it right at my feet. The thin plastic tore slightly against the marble floor, spilling out a few of my basic cotton gym shirts and some tangled phone charging cables. It was a calculated visual insult. My beautiful, carefully curated wardrobe had been confiscated, and they had stuffed my cheapest, least valuable items into a trash bag to drive the point home. Dad was generous enough to let me pack a few bare essentials for your new impoverished lifestyle, Jasmine said, taking a slow sip of her martini. She looked me up and down with absolute contempt. Do not bother asking about your designer coats or your jewelry collection. Dad had his accountants audit your closet. Everything of actual value was purchased with family money or corporate bonuses, so it technically belongs to the trust. You are officially walking away with exactly what you are worth. Nothing. I stared at my sister, the undisputed golden child of our family. She thrived on tearing me down to elevate herself. She had spent her entire life following our parents' toxic playbook, allowing them to dictate her career, her friends, and her marriage just to stay in their favor. She looked at me expecting to see devastation. She wanted me to scream at her. She wanted me to cause a massive scene so she could call the police and have me dragged out of the building like a hysterical trespasser. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I locked my knees and stood completely still. I kept my face entirely blank, masking the violent storm of betrayal raging inside my chest. I would not let my breathing hitch. I would not let a single tear form in my eyes. I was entirely done playing the emotional punching bag for a family that viewed my pain as a spectator sport. Seeing that my silence was denying her the dramatic reaction she craved, Jasmine frowned. She turned to her husband, seeking backup. Preston was more than happy to step in and escalate the cruelty. He chuckled a low, grating sound that echoed in the quiet lobby. He stepped forward, invading Andre's personal space. Preston was used to using his race and his inherited hedge fund wealth to intimidate people. He looked Andre up and down, examining my husband's casual travel clothes with blatant disgust. "Welcome to the real world, teacher," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I guess marrying the boss daughter did not secure you the free ride you were hoping for. You played a bold game, but you bet on the wrong horse." Preston reached into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a thick silver money clip. He peeled off a single crumpled $20 bill. With a mocking theatrical sigh, he extended his hand toward Andre. Here, Preston sneered, flicking the bill so it brushed against Andre's chest. "Buy your wife a hot meal on the bus ride home. Atlanta transit can be rough this time of night, but I am sure you are used to it." My nails dug so deeply into my own palms that I felt the skin break. The sheer disrespect, the blatant classist and racially coded arrogance radiating from Preston made my blood boil. He was a man who had never earned a single dollar of his own wealth. Yet he stood there humiliating my husband, who he assumed was nothing but a helpless community center employee. I wanted to slap the smug look right off his face. I wanted to tear into him and my sister, until they both shrank away in fear. But I stayed absolutely silent. I gripped my fists at my sides, drawing strength from my own immense self-control. If I reacted, I would lose my power. I shifted my gaze to Andre, expecting him to be furious. Any normal man would have knocked Preston to the marble floor for that level of disrespect. But Andre did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not even clench his jaw. My husband looked at Preston with an expression of profound, chilling pity. It was the look a brilliant chess grandmaster gives a novice who has just proudly made a fatal mistake on the board. Andre reached out calmly and took the crumpled $20 bill from Preston's hand. He smoothed out the creases with slow, deliberate movements. He did not say a single word in defense of his pride or his bank account. His absolute silence unsettled Preston. The arrogant smirk on my brother-in-law face faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a brief flash of confusion. Preston was used to men either bowing to him or fighting him. He did not know how to process a man who looked right through him, as if he were completely insignificant. Jasmine crossed her arms, glaring at me. "You made your bed." "Kiara?" She snapped, her voice shrill and defensive. "You ruined the corporate merger Dad spent 2 years setting up. You embarrassed our family in front of the entire city just to prove a point. Now you get to live like a regular person. Enjoy the struggle. Do not bother calling Mom when the reality of being broke finally hits you. You are dead to this family." I looked Jasmine dead in the eyes. Her words were meant to crush me, but they only solidified my resolve. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table where the food was poisoned. They were cutting me off from their wealth, but they were also cutting me off from their control. They thought they were burying me, but they had no idea they had just planted a seed that was about to grow into a massive, uncontrollable empire. "I am not going to call anyone Jasmine," I said, my voice dangerously soft and completely steady. "You can keep the condo. You can keep the designer bags. You can keep playing the obedient puppet for a man who will sell you out the minute your husband hedge fund stops performing. I am walking away clean." Jasmine opened her mouth to shoot back another insult, but Andre gently placed his hand on the small of my back. His touch was a grounding force, a silent signal that our time in this toxic environment was officially over. The performance had reached its end. The trap was set, and my family had eagerly, blindly walked right into it. Andre turned toward David, the concierge who had been forced to facilitate my eviction. David stood frozen behind his heavy mahogany desk, his eyes darting nervously. Andre approached him with slow, deliberate steps. He extended his hand, holding out the crumpled $20 bill Preston had just flicked at his chest. "You have had a long evening, David," Andre said, his voice remarkably gentle, devoid of any malice. "Buy yourself a hot meal on your way home." David stared at the money, utterly speechless, as Andre set it neatly on the polished marble counter. It was the ultimate dismissal. Andre did not throw the money back at Preston. He did not engage in a petty shouting match. He simply reallocated the insult as a tip to a working man, entirely stripping my arrogant brother-in-law of his intended power. I left the cheap plastic garbage bag right where Jasmine dropped it. I did not need old gym shirts and tangled phone chargers. I was walking away with my dignity entirely intact. We stepped through the heavy revolving glass doors and out into the humid Atlanta night air. The city streets hummed with traffic. I expected Andre to pull out his phone and order a rideshare. I expected us to wait on the curb while my sister and her husband watched us from the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of the VIP lounge, pointing and laughing at our newly impoverished reality. Instead, a pristine, custom, midnight black Maybach glided smoothly to the curb, stopping precisely where we stood. The tinted windows shielded the interior completely. A driver in a sharp-tailored suit stepped out immediately. He did not ask for a name. He did not check a ride app. He walked straight to the rear door and opened it, bowing his head slightly. "Good evening, sir." "Good evening, ma'am," the driver said, his tone conveying deep, unwavering respect. I froze for a fraction of a second. As a financial strategist, I knew exactly how much a custom Maybach cost. I knew the distinct difference between a rented luxury car service and a private, dedicated driver. I looked at Andre. He offered me a warm, reassuring smile and gently guided me toward the open door. We slid into the spacious, quiet interior. The doors closed with a heavy, solid thud, completely shutting out the noise of the city and the toxic gravity of my former life. The scent of rich leather and subtle cedar filled the cabin. Andre reached over and took my hand, his thumb tracing slow, calming circles against my skin. "Where are we going?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the insulated silence of the car. "Home," Andre replied simply. I did not elaborate and I did not push. I leaned back against the plush seat, closing my eyes for a moment. The adrenaline of the confrontation was slowly fading, leaving behind a strange floating sensation. For 35 years, my entire existence had been defined by my father, corporate demands, and my mother, image-obsessed conditions. Tonight I lost my condo, my savings, my investment portfolios, and my blood relatives. Yet sitting in the back of this silent car, holding the hand of the man they called a broke teacher, I felt an absolute unshakable sense of safety. The Maybach glided through the glowing streets of Atlanta, bypassing the bustling downtown core and heading straight toward Buckhead. I knew this district intimately. It was the wealthiest zip code in the city, an enclave of generational wealth tech billionaires and sprawling estates hidden behind iron gates. It was the exact kind of neighborhood where my father had spent decades trying to buy social leverage. We pulled up to an architectural marvel of a high-rise. The building was a towering spire of dark glass and steel piercing the night sky. It was completely isolated from the main thoroughfare, surrounded by high privacy walls and dense manicured foliage. The driver did not pull up to the main lobby entrance. Instead, he steered the Maybach toward a discreet subterranean ramp. A heavy steel security gate sensed our approach and glided open silently. We descended into a brightly lit, spotless private garage. There were no other cars around. The space was completely secure, isolated from the rest of the building. The driver parked and opened my door. Andre led me away from the car toward a sleek, featureless steel wall at the far end of the garage. There was no keycard reader. There was no keypad. There was only a small, dark glass square embedded in the metal. Andre did not reach into his pocket. He simply placed his thumb against the glass square. A soft green light scanned his biometric signature. The heavy steel walls seamlessly parted down the middle, revealing a private glass-walled elevator. We stepped inside. I looked around for a floor panel, but there were no buttons to push. The elevator knew exactly where to go. The doors glided shut and we accelerated upward with breathtaking speed. Through the glass walls, I watched the city of Atlanta fall away beneath us as we ascended past 40, 50, 60 floors. The higher we went, the more the frantic energy of the city shrank into a distant, glittering grid. The elevator slowed down and came to a smooth halt. There was no hallway. There was no vestibule. The doors opened directly into the living space. I stepped out and my breath caught sharply in my throat. It was a sprawling, immaculate penthouse. The sheer scale of the space was staggering. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire perimeter, offering a flawless, unobstructed 360-degree panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretched out like a blanket of diamonds far beneath us. My professional mind instantly calculated the real estate value, $15 million at minimum. And that was before factoring in the interior design. The floors were polished, imported Italian marble. The furniture was minimalist but radiated extreme custom luxury. Massive original abstract paintings hung on the gallery white walls. A sweeping floating staircase led to a second level. A grand piano sat silently in the corner, bathed in the soft glow of the city lights. This was not just wealth. This was infinite, untouchable power. It made my father's corporate mansion look like a middle-class starter home. I stood frozen in the center of the massive living room, clutching my purse. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. My father just spent the entire evening orchestrating a brutal financial execution, confident he was sending me to live on the streets. My sister and her arrogant husband mocked my husband with a crumpled $20 bill, completely unaware that the man they were insulting resided in a fortress in the sky. Andre walked past me, his footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. He headed toward a custom backlit wet bar, crafted from dark walnut and obsidian. He casually shrugged off his tailored suit jacket, draping it over a plush velvet chair. He slowly rolled up the sleeves of his crisp white dress shirt, exposing his forearms. He reached for a crystal decanter and poured 2 measures of a rich amber liquid. He did not rush. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who owned his universe entirely. He picked up the 2 heavy crystal glasses and walked back toward me. The soft lighting of the penthouse caught the sharp angles of his face. The gentle, humble community center teacher I married was gone. In his place stood a titan, a man whose quiet composure hid a brilliant, lethal intellect. He stopped right in front of me and handed me a glass. His dark eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. A slow, dangerous smile curved the corner of his mouth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wife," he said, his voice a low magnetic rumble in the quiet penthouse. "We need to talk about my day job." I took the heavy crystal glass from his hand. The rich amber liquid burned smoothly down my throat, grounding me in the surreal reality of the moment. I walked over to the sprawling custom sectional sofa and sat down, placing my glass on the massive obsidian coffee table. The cool leather of the couch offered a stark contrast to the burning adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins since we were thrown out of our own wedding reception. Andre sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows resting on his knees. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the sleek black envelope he had handed me in the car earlier. He placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward me. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Read them thoroughly." I set my drink aside and broke the silver wax seal. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. As a financial strategist, reading complex corporate paperwork is practically my native language. I know how to scan for liabilities, asset allocations, and ownership structures faster than most people can read a menu. I spread the papers across the dark walnut surface. The first page was a certificate of incorporation. The logo at the top belonged to Apex Vanguard Partners. My breath hitched in my throat. Apex Vanguard was a ghost in the financial sector. They were a massive venture capital firm known for ruthlessly acquiring tech startups and restructuring failing corporate giants. They controlled billions in assets, yet their executive board was entirely comprised of legal proxies and shadow directors. No one in my industry knew who the true founder was. They operated with lethal precision, executing corporate takeovers that left Wall Street analysts completely stunned. I flipped to the second page, reviewing the capitalization tables and the controlling interest declarations. I traced my finger down to the bottom of the final sheet. There, on the primary signature line denoting 100% sole ownership, was a name written in bold black ink: Andre Kingston. I looked up from the documents and stared at the man sitting across from me. The man who spent his weekends helping inner-city teenagers build basic mobile applications owned the entire firm outright. He was the apex predator of the venture capital world. "Explain this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not out of anger, but out of sheer brilliant shock. Andre leaned back, sinking into the leather sofa. He looked out at the glowing Atlanta skyline before turning his dark eyes back to me. He told me his story without an ounce of arrogance. He grew up in the West End watching his mother work 3 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. He taught himself to code on outdated library computers. By the time he was 25, he had developed a proprietary data compression algorithm that revolutionized cloud storage. I sold that single algorithm to a major tech conglomerate for 9 figures. I used that capital to build Apex Vanguard Partners. But the wealth brought parasites. He described the suffocating reality of sudden extreme wealth. People he had known his whole life suddenly viewed him as a walking bank account. The corporate world was even more toxic, filled with arrogant, entitled men who reminded me exactly of my father, Reginald, and my brother-in-law, Preston. Andre realized early on that if he operated publicly, his entire existence would be consumed by board meetings, press conferences, and people begging for handouts. So he stepped back into the shadows. He installed trusted proxies to handle the public face of the company. He secured his wealth behind layers of ironclad legal protection. He wanted to preserve his soul, so he went back to the community center. He wanted to give kids from his old neighborhood the resources and mentorship he never had. "That is where I met you," Andre said, a soft smile breaking through his serious expression. "You were volunteering to run a financial literacy seminar for the high school seniors. I watched you break down complex economic strategies into language those kids could actually understand. You were brilliant, sharp, and incredibly kind." I stared at him, my mind racing to reconcile the modest man I fell in love with and the billionaire titan sitting before me. "But why keep this a secret from me?" I asked. "We have been together for 2 years, Andre. You let my family insult you. You let my father call you a broke teacher in front of hundreds of people. You let Preston hand you a $20 bill like you were a beggar. Why did you take that abuse? Andre reached across the coffee table and took my hands in his. His grip was warm and grounding. Because I watched how your family treated you, Kiara. I saw the strings attached to every single dollar your father ever spent. I saw how your mother Vivian weaponized her affection based on your compliance. They viewed you as an asset to be managed, not a daughter to be loved. I knew that if I revealed my wealth, your father would immediately try to use me to expand his own empire. I would have forced you to marry me just for the corporate synergy. He squeezed my hands, his eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, unwavering intensity. I wanted a partner. I wanted an equal. I wanted a woman who loved the man in the worn sweaters, who brought her cheap takeout and listened to her vent about corporate strategy until 2 in the morning. I wanted to be absolutely certain that the woman I married chose me for my heart and not my portfolio. You never broke, Kiara. Andre continued, his voice thick with raw emotion. You worked 80-hour weeks to build your own career. You endured their constant psychological abuse, and you never compromised your integrity to fit their mold. When your father threatened to cut you off at the wedding reception, you did not flinch. You held my hand and you walked out of that ballroom ready to build a life with me from scratch. You proved that your loyalty cannot be bought. I sat back against the plush sofa, pulling my hands free to cover my face. My mind processed the sheer magnitude of this reality. For 35 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I was the disappointment because I refused to marry a corporate clone. My father, Reginald, believed my value was strictly tied to his logistics empire. He evicted me from my home, froze my bank accounts, and expected me to crawl back on my hands and knees begging for mercy. I thought he had stripped me of all my armor. He wanted me to break under the pressure of sudden poverty. Instead, he pushed me straight into an impenetrable fortress. I looked at Andre. There was absolutely no pity in his eyes. There was only profound respect and a fierce protective partnership. For the very first time in my entire life, I did not have to earn my right to be safe. I did not have to hit a quarterly financial target to be worthy of a roof over my head. I did not have to shrink my personality, dim my intelligence, or bite my tongue to make a fragile, arrogant man feel powerful. A deep, overwhelming sense of validation washed over my entire body. It started in my chest and radiated outward, completely dismantling the decades of anxiety my parents had instilled in me. I was not the family failure. I was the woman chosen by a titan specifically because my mind, my resilience, and my heart were exactly what he wanted. He saw the brilliance in me that my own mother and father intentionally tried to crush. The tears I refused to shed for my family, when they threw my clothes in a garbage bag, finally fell. They spilled hot and fast down my cheeks, dropping onto the collar of my dress. But these were not tears of sorrow or grief. They were tears of absolute liberation. The heavy, suffocating chain of the black tax, the endless pressure to perform for parents who would never be satisfied, the constant comparisons to my sister Jasmine, all of it dissolved into nothingness. Andre moved from his side of the table and sat directly beside me on the sofa. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, pulling me against his chest. I buried my face in his shirt, letting the realization sink deep into my bones. We were safe. We were untouchable. My family had executed their absolute worst punishment, and it meant absolutely nothing. I am so proud to be your wife, I whispered against his chest, my voice thick with emotion, but steady with newfound strength. He kissed the top of my head, resting his chin against my hair. We have a lot of work to do, Mrs. Wife, he murmured softly. Your father thrives on leveraging debt and controlling narratives. Now that you know the truth about my resources, we are going to rewrite the rules of his game. I pulled back, wiping the tears from my cheeks. A slow, sharp smile spread across my face, mirroring the dangerous confidence I had seen in him earlier. My financial strategist instincts, the very skills my father mocked, were fully awake and hungry. Reginald wanted to play corporate warfare, and he had just handed the enemy his entire playbook. Show me everything, I said, pointing to the Vanguard documents scattered across the coffee table. Every shell company, every proxy board, every hidden asset. If we are going to war, I need to see the entire battlefield. I did not sleep that night. Andre offered me his office, a sleek, minimalist space on the second floor of the penthouse, fully equipped with high-speed secure servers and multiple monitors. I sat at his massive glass desk, surrounded by the sleeping city, and unleashed the full force of my analytical training. For 15 years, my father had praised Jasmine for playing the role of the perfect socialite, while completely dismissing the grueling corporate financial strategy I executed every single day. I knew logistics. I knew supply chain economics. I knew how to dissect a corporate balance sheet until it bled. I pulled up the public filings for Reginald's company Titan Logistics. On the surface, the numbers looked solid. The stock price was stable, the quarterly reports painted a picture of consistent growth, and the PR narrative was flawless. But as a financial strategist, I knew that public filings were just the glossy cover of a very messy book. You do not look at what a CEO wants you to see. You look at what they are actively trying to hide. I bypassed the public-facing documents and dug straight into the SEC regulatory filings, cross-referencing them against independent supply chain data and global freight indexes. The deeper I went, the more the illusion began to crack. Titan Logistics was built on a massive fleet of cargo ships and a sprawling network of domestic distribution centers. 5 years ago, Reginald had leveraged heavily to modernize his fleet, taking out astronomical loans under the assumption that global shipping rates would remain sky-high. It was a classic arrogant gamble, but shipping rates had crashed over the last 3 quarters. Fuel costs surged. Labor disputes had stalled operations at 2 of his primary ports. I pulled up the debt-to-equity ratios and felt a cold, sharp thrill. Titan Logistics was drowning. They were suffocating under the weight of short-term high-interest debt that was coming due simultaneously. Reginald was moving money between shell companies, cooking the books just enough to pass regulatory audits while desperately trying to keep the ship afloat. The profit margins he bragged about at family dinners were completely fabricated. He was liquidating assets, laying off mid-level staff, and slashing operational budgets, all while continuing to throw multi-million-dollar weddings for Jasmine to maintain the facade of infinite wealth. I was terrified. I could see the panic written in every redacted financial footnote. If the market realized the true state of Titan Logistics, the stock would crater overnight, and Reginald would face complete ruin. He needed an exit strategy, and he needed it immediately before the next quarterly earnings report exposed his catastrophic failures. I leaned back in the ergonomic chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. I pulled up the Vanguard documents Andre had given me, comparing them against my findings. Reginald's only way out was a complete buyout. He needed a firm with enough liquid capital to absorb his massive debt and restructure the company. He needed a buyer who operated aggressively and quietly. He needed Apex Vanguard partners. I switched tabs, pulling up the acquisition pipelines within Andre's firm. The Vanguard system was a fortress, but Andre had granted me full administrative access. I searched for Titan Logistics. The file appeared instantly. The status read acquisition pending, final due diligence. I opened the communication logs. There were dozens of emails from Reginald's legal team to Vanguard's proxy board, practically begging for the buyout to be finalized within the month. Reginald was offering significant concessions, willing to step down as CEO, willing to surrender controlling interest, willing to do absolutely anything, as long as the acquisition went through quietly, allowing him to walk away with a massive payout and his reputation intact. He believed he was negotiating with a faceless corporate entity. He had no idea that the ultimate decision-maker, the sole owner of Apex Vanguard Partners, was the man he had just publicly humiliated, the man whose face he had smirked at while dragging me out of my own wedding. The irony was staggering. Reginald had spent my entire life trying to control me, trying to force me to marry corporate allies to strengthen his empire. Yet he was entirely dependent on my husband to save him from complete annihilation. The door to the office opened softly. Andre walked in carrying 2 mugs of dark coffee. He had changed into soft sweatpants and a t-shirt, looking completely relaxed, a stark contrast to the corporate bloodbath unfolding on the screens before me. He set a mug down beside my hand and leaned over my shoulder, his eyes scanning the data I had pulled up. "He is finished," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline coursing through me. He is carrying over 400 million in short-term debt, and his primary distribution hubs are operating at a 20% deficit. If Vanguard pulls out of the acquisition, Titan Logistics will be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy within 60 days. Andre took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the screen showing Reginald's desperate emails. He has been pushing my proxy board aggressively for the past 3 weeks. Andre noted his tone completely neutral. He wants the buyout finalized before his next board meeting. He thinks he can walk away with a golden parachute and leave us to clean up the mess. I turned to look at Andre. The power dynamic in the room was absolute. My husband held the fate of my father's entire legacy in his hands. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Andre did not answer immediately. He looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face, reading the years of suppression, the anger, the sharp, brilliant mind that my family had tried to bury. He saw the woman who had been kicked out of her home just hours ago. "The question is not what I'm going to do," Kiara Andre said softly, his voice a low rumble. "The question is, what are we going to do? This is your family. This is your battle. I am just providing the artillery." He reached out his thumb, gently tracing the line of my jaw. "Do we finalize the acquisition and strip him of his company quietly? Or do we let him sink?" I looked back at the screen, at the arrogant, demanding tone of Reginald's emails. I thought of Jasmine's smug face in the lobby, Preston's crumpled $20 bill, Vivian's loud, performative pity. I thought of the 35 years I spent trying to prove my worth to people who viewed me as a disposable asset. I did not want a quiet corporate takeover. I did not want Reginald to walk away with a golden parachute pretending he had retired a victorious titan of industry. I wanted him to face the exact same public humiliation he had inflicted on me. I wanted him to feel the ground completely drop out from beneath his feet in front of the very people he spent his life trying to impress. "We don't acquire the company," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "But we don't just decline the offer either. We let him think the deal is secured. We let him celebrate his salvation. And then we publicly expose the debt and pull the plug." Andre's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. The apex predator was fully awake, and he approved of the strategy. "A public execution," Andre murmured, nodding slowly. "I like the way you think, Mrs. Wife." He reached over my shoulder and tapped the keyboard, pulling up the communication logs. "I will have the proxy board draft the final preliminary agreements. We will give him exactly enough rope to hang himself." The plan was set. We were going to dismantle Reginald's empire not with shouting or dramatic scenes, but with cold, hard, inescapable data. I picked up my coffee, the warmth seeping into my hands. The fear and anxiety that had plagued me for decades were completely gone, replaced by a ruthless, unshakable clarity. My family had demanded a corporate war, and they were about to realize they had brought a knife to a nuclear launch. The sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a brilliant golden glow across the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. We had stayed up through the entire night finalizing the strategy. Andre did not waste a single second. At exactly 8 in the morning, he picked up his phone and called his lead proxy. The man on the other end of the line was a senior corporate attorney who handled the public-facing negotiations for Apex Vanguard Partners. Andre instructed him to draft a preliminary letter of intent for the acquisition of Titan Logistics. The genius of the trap was in the legal phrasing. As a financial strategist, I helped Andre weave specific contingency clauses deep into the massive stack of contractual paperwork. To a desperate man, the documents looked like a guaranteed multi-million-dollar bailout. But to a trained eye, the clauses clearly stated that Vanguard retained the absolute right to pull out of the acquisition at the 11th hour if any hidden debt or operational deficits were discovered during the final phase of due diligence. We already knew the debt existed. We were simply handing my father a loaded gun and waiting for him to pull the trigger. Less than an hour after the proxy emailed the documents, Reginald signed them. He did not hesitate. He did not ask his legal team to negotiate the terms. He was bleeding cash so rapidly that he blindly accepted the lifeline we threw him. My father electronically returned the signed letter of intent, with a message expressing his deep gratitude to the Vanguard board. He had absolutely no idea that the board he was thanking consisted entirely of my husband. For the next few days, we watched my father operate from the absolute comfort of our fortress in the sky. With my access to the Vanguard surveillance systems, I monitored the frantic financial movements happening inside Titan Logistics. The moment the preliminary agreement was signed, Reginald began acting as if the money was already in his bank account. He stopped liquidating his assets. He halted the mid-level staff layoffs. I even took out another short-term high-interest loan, using the Vanguard letter of intent as collateral. It was a spectacular display of corporate arrogance. I was betting his entire legacy on a handshake with a ghost. During those days, I also witnessed the stark difference between the life I had left behind and the life I was now building. In my father's house, love and security were strictly conditional. If I did not secure a lucrative corporate merger through marriage, I was worthless. If I did not bow to my mother's image-obsessed demands, I was a failure. But here in the penthouse with Andre, there were no conditions. He did not ask me to shrink myself. He empowered my sharpest, most ruthless instincts. We worked side by side, dissecting my father's empire piece by piece. Andre treated my mind as his greatest asset. On Thursday afternoon, the private elevator in the penthouse chimed a soft melodic tone. Andre and I were sitting at the massive kitchen island, reviewing global shipping indexes, when the stainless steel doors parted. The head of building security stepped out, accompanied by a specialized private courier. The courier looked slightly intimidated by the sheer scale of the penthouse, but he maintained his professional composure. He held a sleek, matte black box tied with an expensive silk ribbon. The security chief nodded respectfully to Andre. He explained that the package had been flagged as highly prioritized and marked for immediate personal delivery to my attention. The courier required my direct signature. I signed the electronic pad, took the box, and thanked the men before they retreated to the elevator. I set the black box on the kitchen island. The packaging was distinctively opulent. It practically screamed new money desperation. I untied the silk ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was a heavy gold-leafed invitation card. The cardstock was impossibly thick, engraved with elegant calligraphy. I did not even need to read the sender name to know exactly who it was from. Only my mother Vivian would spend this much money on a simple piece of stationery just to prove a point. I picked up the invitation and read the elegant script aloud. Reginald and Vivian request the honor of your presence at the inaugural Titan Logistics Charity Gala, a night celebrating Black excellence, corporate synergy, and the dawn of a new financial era. I scoffed, shaking my head at the absolute audacity of the wording. My parents were hosting a high society charity gala at one of the most exclusive venues in Atlanta. But the charity aspect was just a smokescreen. The real purpose of the gala was printed right there in the subtext: the dawn of a new financial era. Reginald was going to use the event to publicly announce the Vanguard acquisition to his shareholders, his board of directors, and the media. He wanted to stand on a stage in front of the entire city and declare himself a victorious corporate titan. He was spending the last of his borrowed money to throw a massive party, celebrating a deal that was never going to happen. But the invitation was not the most important part of the package. Tucked beneath the gold-leafed card was a small square of cream-colored stationery. It was a handwritten note from my mother. Her sharp, precise handwriting was unmistakable. I picked up the note and read it carefully. A cold, tight smile spread across my face. Vivian could never resist an opportunity to twist the knife. She had driven me out of my condo, frozen my accounts, and thrown my clothes in a garbage bag. But that was not enough for her. She needed me to witness her triumph. She needed to rub my face in my supposed failure. I handed the note to Andre. He took it and read my mother's words aloud, his deep voice filling the quiet kitchen. Come see what real success looks like. We will leave 2 seats in the very back for you and the teacher. Try to dress appropriately. Andre let out a low, resonant laugh. He tossed the note back onto the marble island, shaking his head in sheer disbelief. The absolute arrogance of my family was staggering. They had no idea that the teacher they were mocking was the man who held the deed to their entire corporate existence. They were inviting the executioner directly to their own execution and demanding that he sit in the back row. They are handing us the stage, Andre said, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous, brilliant light. Reginald wants to announce the Vanguard merger to the entire city. He wants the cameras rolling and the investors watching. He is building the exact platform we need to tear his empire to the ground. I looked down at the condescending note from my mother. I thought about my sister Jasmine smirking at me in the lobby. I thought about Preston flicking that $20 bill at my husband's chest. I thought about the decades of emotional manipulation, the constant gaslighting, and the absolute certainty my family had that I would always be their helpless victim. They expected me to show up to this gala wearing cheap clothes, keeping my head down and weeping with regret in the back row. They wanted me to watch them ascend to the ranks of billionaires while I faded into impoverished obscurity. I picked up the gold-leafed invitation and tapped it thoughtfully against the edge of the marble island. A powerful, unyielding energy surged through my veins. The terrified, obedient daughter who constantly sought her father's approval was completely dead. The woman standing in this penthouse was a financial strategist armed with limitless capital and absolute clarity. I looked up at my husband, meeting his dark, unwavering gaze. He was ready. I was ready. The trap was set perfectly, and my family had just sent us the coordinates for the final strike. I am not sitting in the back row, I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. And you are not showing up to an execution looking like a community center teacher. If my mother wants to see what real success looks like, we are going to give her a front row education. I slid the invitation back into the black box. I reached for my purse and pulled out the sleek, heavy metal black card Andre had given me earlier that morning. It had no limit and no restrictions. I looked at Andre and smiled. Let us go shopping. A week before the charity gala, my phone vibrated with a sharp, aggressive buzz. It was a text message from my mother. It was not an invitation. It was a royal summons. Vivian demanded that Andre and I attend a mandatory family dinner at the Sovereign, a ridiculously overpriced five-star steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead. She claimed they needed to discuss family protocol for the upcoming gala to ensure we did not embarrass them in front of the press. I showed the text to Andre. He simply smiled and adjusted his watch. We knew exactly what this dinner was meant to be. It was a power play. Reginald and Vivian wanted to drag us into their territory, force us to sit across from them, and remind us of our newly impoverished place in the family hierarchy. They wanted to parade their impending corporate victory right in our faces. I walked into my massive custom closet in the penthouse and selected my armor for the evening. I did not choose anything with a flashy logo. I did not want loud patterns or heavy gold hardware screaming for attention. True wealth whispers while new money shouts. I chose a quiet luxury ensemble. I wore a pure silk cream blouse, tailored cashmere trousers, and a pair of understated Italian leather heels. The entire outfit cost more than my mother spent on her last car, but because it lacked a giant designer emblem, I knew Vivian would look at me and assume I bought it off a discount rack. Andre dressed to match my energy, wearing a charcoal-tailored jacket over a crisp, dark shirt, looking effortlessly immaculate. We took a standard ride share to the restaurant, leaving the Maybach and the private driver safely tucked away in the penthouse garage. We were committed to playing our parts until the absolute last second. The hostess led us to a private dining room, enclosed by heavy velvet curtains and dark mahogany walls. My family was already seated and holding court. Reginald was actively ignoring his wife, scrolling aggressively through his phone, likely checking the stagnant stock prices of Titan Logistics. Vivian sat stiffly, her neck draped in heavy diamonds, inspecting her reflection in a silver spoon. Jasmine and Preston sat on the opposite side of the massive round table. Jasmine let out a loud, theatrical sigh the moment we walked into the room. She leaned over and whispered something to Preston, making sure we could see her, rolling her eyes. My mother finally looked up. Her gaze swept over my unbranded silk blouse, and she gave me a look of profound, devastating pity. She completely missed the flawless stitching and the premium fabric. In her mind, I was a broke outcast wearing cheap clothes. Sit down, Kiara Vivian commanded, waving a manicured hand toward two empty chairs positioned at the absolute furthest end of the table. Try not to make a scene tonight. Your father has a massive corporate merger closing soon, and we are all under a considerable amount of stress. Andre pulled out my chair for me before taking his own seat. We sat down in total silence. Preston immediately took control of the room. As a white man born into generations of hedge fund wealth, he operated with an exhausting level of unearned confidence. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, swirling a glass of sparkling water, and loudly hijacked the conversation. He did not ask how we were doing. He did not ask how we were surviving our eviction. He launched directly into a relentless boasting session about his own financial brilliance. Preston bragged about a recent trade his hedge fund executed, claiming he secured a 6% return for his clients over the last quarter. He spoke loudly, using basic financial jargon that he clearly thought would fly right over our heads. He talked about market volatility and risk assessment, acting as though he was the undisputed king of Wall Street. I sat there sipping my ice water and keeping my face entirely blank. I was a senior financial strategist. I knew for a fact that a 6% quarterly return in the current market was embarrassingly mediocre. But I said absolutely nothing. I glanced at Andre. My husband, the stealth founder of a venture capital firm that routinely engineered 400% returns on hostile takeovers, was listening to Preston with an expression of polite, mild amusement. Andre looked like a physics professor listening to a toddler brag about learning to count to 10. Preston noticed Andre's calm demeanor and clearly took it as a personal insult. Preston hated the fact that Andre never looked intimidated by his wealth. He needed to assert his dominance. He needed to put the Black community center teacher back in his place. The private dining room doors opened, and the head sommelier walked in, carrying a leather-bound wine menu. He approached the table with a respectful nod toward my father. Preston snapped his fingers loudly, cutting off whatever the sommelier was about to say. "We will take 2 bottles of the Chateau Margaux for the table," Preston ordered, his voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "Make sure they are decanted properly." That was a $2,000 bottle of wine. Preston looked directly at Andre, a cruel, mocking smirk spreading across his face. "Actually?" Preston continued, raising his hand to stop the sommelier from walking away. "Bring something different for my brother-in-law here. He is just a community center coding teacher. His palate probably is not accustomed to fine Bordeaux. Just bring him a glass of the absolute cheapest house red you have on the menu. We would not want to overwhelm his system with anything outside his tax bracket." A harsh, chilling silence fell over the private dining room. The sommelier froze completely, taken aback by the blatant classist and racially coded disrespect. He looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting his weight and glancing nervously at my father. Reginald did not intervene. He did not correct his son-in-law. My father simply took a sip of his water and looked at his phone, allowing the humiliation to hang heavy in the air. Jasmine let out a sharp, cruel giggle, hiding her mouth behind her napkin. Vivian looked slightly embarrassed by the lack of etiquette, but she quickly smoothed her expression into one of passive agreement. I felt a spike of pure, white-hot rage ignite in my chest. My hands gripped the heavy linen napkin on my lap. Preston was attempting to strip my husband of his dignity in front of my entire family, treating him like a second-class citizen, purely for his own twisted amusement. I wanted to stand up, grab that leather wine menu, and slam it onto the table. I wanted to look Preston dead in the eyes and tell him that Andre could buy his entire generational hedge fund with pocket change and liquidate it before the appetizers even arrived. I took a deep breath, forcing the anger down. I locked my jaw and maintained my absolute composure. If I reacted, I would give Preston exactly what he wanted. I would be the angry defensive wife, validating his narrative that we were broke and desperate. Andre did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He did not show a single ounce of embarrassment or anger. He looked at Preston with that same quiet, chilling authority he possessed in the penthouse. Andre turned his attention to the deeply uncomfortable sommelier and offered a warm, gracious smile. "A glass of your house red sounds perfectly fine," Andre said, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered. "Thank you, I appreciate it." The sommelier gave a quick, relieved nod and hurried out of the room. Preston frowned. His cruel smirk vanished instantly. He expected Andre to argue, to look humiliated, or to sink into his chair in shame. Instead, Andre had accepted the insult with such profound, unshakable confidence that it completely neutralized Preston's attack. Preston shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly looking like a small, petty man who had just thrown a rock at a brick wall and accomplished absolutely nothing. The dynamic in the room shifted. My family thought they were dragging us to an execution. They thought they were holding all the power. They had no idea they were sitting at a table with a man who had already signed the death warrant for their entire corporate empire. I picked up my water glass and took a slow, deliberate sip, staring right at my mother. The real dinner was just about to begin. The sommelier returned a few minutes later carrying a silver tray. He meticulously uncorked the Chateau Margaux, pouring the dark, rich wine into large crystal glasses for my father, my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law. Preston swirled his glass, burying his nose in the rim and offering a loud, obnoxious sigh of approval. Then the sommelier stepped over to Andre. He quietly poured the cheap house red into a standard glass. Andre thanked him again with that same unshakable, polite warmth. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind the sommelier, leaving us alone in the private dining room. The air was thick with unspoken hostility. Reginald cleared his throat. He set his wine glass down and reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a folded piece of thick corporate stationery bearing the Titan Logistics letterhead. He placed his hand flat on top of the paper and looked directly at Andre. "I am a pragmatic man." Reginald began, his voice echoing with the booming authority he used in his boardrooms. "I do not let emotion dictate my business or my family affairs. My daughter made a spectacularly foolish decision by throwing away a life of privilege to marry you. She let romantic delusion cloud her financial judgment. I evicted her to teach her a necessary lesson about the real world. But I do not want my own flesh and blood starving on the streets because her husband cannot provide for her." Reginald slid the folded document across the polished table. It stopped right in front of Andre's plate. "That is an employment contract," Reginald stated, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. "It is an entry-level IT support position in the mailroom at Titan Logistics headquarters. You will be sorting packages, fixing jammed printers, and resetting passwords for my junior executives. The salary is $35,000 a year. It is a massive step down from the lifestyle Kiara is accustomed to, but it is a step up from a community center paycheck. Consider it a charitable donation to keep a roof over your heads." Jasmine let out a sharp laugh. "That is incredibly generous of you, Dad." She turned to me with a mockingly sweet smile. "You really should thank him, Kiara. Not many fathers would offer a handout to a man who basically ruined their daughter life." Preston smirked, taking a large gulp of his $2,000 wine. "Better sign it quick, teacher, before the boss changes his mind." I stared at the piece of paper resting on the table. The sheer staggering irony of the situation nearly made me laugh out loud. My father, sitting on $400 million of high-interest debt, begging for a corporate bailout from a faceless venture capital firm, was offering the sole owner of that exact firm a job fixing his printers. Reginald was trying to assert his dominance over the man who held the execution warrant for his entire empire. Andre did not look insulted. He picked up the contract with the calm, focused attention he gave to billion-dollar merger agreements. He unfolded the thick paper and read the terms, scanning the meager salary, the degrading job description, and the strict probationary clauses my father had maliciously included. Andre folded the paper neatly and slid it right back across the table. "I appreciate the gesture," Reginald Andre said, his voice perfectly smooth and completely void of anger. "But my current position keeps me quite busy, and it fulfills my needs perfectly. I will have to decline." Reginald's face tightened. A dark, angry flush crept up his neck. He was not used to being told no. He was certainly not used to being rejected by someone he considered beneath him. "Pride does not pay the rent, young man." Reginald snapped, his voice dropping into a dangerous warning tone. "You have absolutely no assets. You have no leverage. Do not let your fragile ego blind you to the reality of your situation. You cannot afford to turn down my charity." "Actually," Andre smiled warmly, taking a slow sip of his cheap house red wine, "I think we will be just fine. But thank you for the concern regarding my leverage." The profound, unbothered confidence radiating from my husband completely short-circuited my father. Reginald glared at him, gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He wanted Andre to beg. He wanted Andre to bow his head in shame and accept the humiliating handout. Andre's total refusal to play the role of the defeated poor husband infuriated my father on a cellular level. That was when my mother decided to make her move. Vivian leaned over in her chair, closing the physical distance between us. The heavy, suffocating scent of her expensive floral perfume washed over me. She reached out and placed her manicured hand over mine. Her skin was ice cold. She dropped her voice into a hushed, theatrical whisper designed to sound like desperate maternal concern, but I knew exactly what it was. It was pure toxic gaslighting. "Kiara, sweetheart," Vivian murmured, squeezing my fingers tightly. "Look at him. He is too proud to even accept a job to feed you. Is this really the life you want? You are a brilliant woman. You were raised in luxury. You do not belong in a tiny apartment struggling to pay utility bills while your husband teaches children how to use computers." I did not pull my hand away. I sat perfectly still, looking directly into my mother's eyes. "You are throwing a tantrum," Vivian whispered, her grip tightening painfully on my hand. "We understand that. You wanted to rebel against your father. But the rebellion is over now. You have made your point, and now you are facing the consequences. Poverty is ugly, Kiara. It will age you. It will break your spirit. This man cannot protect you the way this family can." She leaned even closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous hiss. "Divorce him. File the paperwork tomorrow morning. Come to my house, drop to your knees, and apologize to your father for embarrassing us. If you show true remorse, he might let you move back into the condo. Do not ruin your entire future, just because you are too stubborn to admit you made a catastrophic mistake. You can always come back to the family when you get tired of struggling like a regular person." Vivian sat back in her chair, offering me a tight, deeply fake smile of encouragement. She truly believed she was throwing me a lifeline. She thought she was manipulating a terrified, broke daughter into submission. She wanted me to crack right there at the dinner table. She wanted me to break down in tears, agree to leave Andre, and beg for my father forgiveness. I looked at my mother. I looked at my sister, who was eagerly watching my face for any sign of weakness. I looked at Preston, who was chewing his steak with loud, aggressive arrogance. And finally, I looked at my father, whose eyes were constantly darting down to his phone screen, obsessively checking his sinking corporate stock prices. They were so incredibly desperate for me to break, because my submission was the only thing that made them feel powerful. They fed on my pain to distract themselves from their own miserable, hollow lives. I did not snap. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my drink in my mother's face or scream at my father for his audacity. I realized in that exact moment that fighting with them was completely beneath me. You do not argue with people whose entire reality is about to be liquidated. I gently pulled my hand out from under my mother's grip. I reached for my crystal water glass. The ice clinked softly against the sides. I raised the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip of water. I swallowed, carefully maintaining absolute unbroken eye contact with Vivian. I let the silence stretch out, allowing them to sit in the heavy, awkward weight of their own exposed toxicity. I let them show me the absolute darkest corners of their souls, so I would not feel a single ounce of guilt for what we were about to do to them. I set my water glass down on the mahogany table with a soft clink. The ice settled perfectly, mirroring the cold stillness inside me. I turned my attention from my mother's false concern to my father. "I'm declining the mailroom position, Reginald," I said, my voice steady, professional, and completely devoid of the daughterly deference he expected. While fixing printers might be someone's passion, my expertise lies in financial strategy. Reginald sneered, his thick hands resting flat on the table. "Financial strategy. You haven't stepped foot in a boardroom since you married this teacher. Your expertise is currently unemployed, Kiara. Don't confuse a degree with leverage." "Oh, I'm quite aware of leverage," I replied smoothly. "In fact, speaking of strategy, I was looking at the recent global shipping indexes. With fuel costs surging and labor disputes stalling operations at major ports, maintaining a massive leveraged fleet seems precarious." The entire table went dead silent. Reginald's sneer vanished instantly. His eyes, usually sharp and arrogant, darted nervously for a fraction of a second. I had just named the exact operational deficits that were bleeding Titan Logistics dry. "It makes one wonder," I continued, leaning forward slightly, "how a logistics company manages to balance $400 million in short-term debt while their primary distribution hubs are operating at a 20% deficit." My father's face turned an ugly, blotchy red. The vein in his neck pulsed. Vivian looked confused, her eyes darting between me and Reginald, clearly unaware of the actual depth of their financial ruin. Preston stopped chewing his steak, his arrogant smirk replaced by genuine bewilderment. "Where are you getting those numbers?" Reginald demanded, his voice thick with sudden, poorly concealed panic. "You have no access to my internal reports. Public filings are fascinating if you know how to read the footnotes." "Dad," I said, offering a calm, knowing smile. "It just seems like a massive risk to rely on moving money between shell companies to pass regulatory audits. A single market shift in Titan Logistics would be forced into Chapter 11 bankruptcy within 60 days. "That is absolute nonsense!" Reginald barked, slamming his fist on the table so hard the expensive silverware rattled. "You know nothing about the state of my company. You are a bitter, disinherited child trying to sound smart." He took a deep breath, visibly forcing himself to regain control. He smoothed his tie, his chest puffing out with manufactured arrogance. "For your information," Reginald sneered, his voice dripping with condescension, "Titan Logistics is more profitable than ever. In fact, we are in the final stages of a massive corporate buyout. A top-tier venture capital firm, a true tech titan, is acquiring us. When this deal closes next week, I will walk away with a payout that will secure this family's wealth for generations. I'll be richer than I've ever been." He leaned back, a triumphant smirk returning to his face. "So keep your amateur financial analysis to yourself, Kiara. You're entirely out of your league." I looked at Andre. We exchanged a brief, imperceptible glance. My father was desperately trying to assert dominance using a lifeline that Andre himself was holding. Reginald was bragging about the very execution trap we had set for him. "A tech titan buyout," I said, nodding slowly, feigning mild interest. "How fortunate for you. It must be a relief to have an exit strategy before the next quarterly earnings report exposes those operational deficits." "There are no deficits," Reginald roared, losing his temper again. "The deal is secure. The letter of intent is signed. You are nothing but a jealous, failed strategist trying to undermine my success." I smiled. The anger, the defensiveness, the desperate need to prove his wealth, it was all confirmation. He was completely, hopelessly trapped, and he didn't even realize the walls had already closed in. "I suppose we'll see," I said softly. I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up. Andre rose immediately beside me, his movements fluid and relaxed. "We won't be staying for dessert," I announced, looking around the room. "We have other commitments this evening." Vivian gasped, offended by my early departure. "You're leaving? We haven't even discussed the protocol for the charity gala next week. You can't just walk out of a family dinner." "We aren't walking out, Vivian," I corrected her. "We're simply finished here." Jasmine, furious that the dinner hadn't ended with me begging for forgiveness, crossed her arms tightly. Her beautiful face contorted into an ugly, bitter scowl. "Go ahead and leave, Kiara." Jasmine scoffed, her voice shrill with spite. "Go back to your tiny, miserable apartment with your broke husband. You'll always be the family's biggest failure. You ruined your entire life just to prove a point, and now you have absolutely nothing." I didn't engage. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what I was walking back to, and it certainly wasn't a tiny apartment. Andre buttoned his tailored suit jacket, his expression completely serene. He didn't look at Reginald or Preston or Vivian. He looked directly at Jasmine, offering her a warm, polite smile that seemed to infuriate her even more. "See you at the gala, Jasmine," Andre said, his deep voice cutting through the heavy silence of the dining room. He paused, adjusting his cuffs, and added a final, devastatingly casual piece of advice. "Make sure you read the fine print on those merger contracts." Jasmine frowned, confused by the cryptic warning. Reginald's face went completely white. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. Andre placed a protective hand on the small of my back, guiding me toward the heavy mahogany doors. We walked out of the private dining room, leaving my family sitting in a suffocating silence, entirely unaware that the countdown to their public destruction had just officially begun. The week leading up to the charity gala flew by in a blur of relentless strategic planning inside our penthouse. We monitored every desperate financial maneuver my father made, watching him liquidate his final safety nets to fund this extravagant party. When the night of the gala finally arrived, I felt no anxiety. I felt no lingering dread. I only felt the cold, sharp thrill of an apex predator stepping into the hunting grounds. I stood in front of the massive floor-to-ceiling mirror in our master suite and stared at my reflection. For my entire life, my mother had dictated my wardrobe, forcing me into conservative, muted tones that would never risk outshining my sister. Tonight, I dressed for war. I wore a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that cascaded down my frame like liquid glass. It had no flashy designer logos and no gaudy embellishments. It was a masterpiece of quiet luxury, featuring a plunging architectural neckline and a high slit that demanded absolute attention. I paired it with vintage diamond drop earrings and a pair of sleek black stiletto heels. My hair was styled in flawless, voluminous waves that framed my face perfectly. I did not look like the discarded, disinherited daughter. I looked like a queen stepping up to claim her throne. Andre walked up behind me, his reflection joining mine in the glass. He wore a midnight blue bespoke tuxedo with a razor-sharp black lapel. The tailoring accentuated his broad shoulders and commanding presence. He looked every inch the billionaire titan he truly was, shedding the unassuming community center teacher disguise completely. He placed his hands on my waist, leaning down to press a soft kiss against my neck. "We are going to end this tonight," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating with absolute certainty. We took the private elevator down to the subterranean garage. Our driver was waiting beside the midnight black Maybach. The ride to the grand venue in the heart of downtown Atlanta was quiet, filled with the charged electric anticipation of the impending execution. The venue my parents selected was a historic, sprawling estate known for hosting the city's most elite corporate and political gatherings. As our Maybach glided smoothly up the sweeping circular driveway, the magnitude of my father's financial delusion became painfully clear. A literal red carpet was rolled out across the marble steps. Photographers from local business journals and high society magazines crowded behind velvet ropes, their camera flashes exploding like lightning in the humid night air. Valets scrambled to park a parade of Bentleys, Porsches, and imported sports cars. My father was bleeding cash, yet he had spared absolutely no expense to project an illusion of infinite wealth. Our driver opened my door and I stepped out onto the red carpet. The moment my heels hit the pavement, the energy of the crowd shifted. Power operates on a distinct frequency, and people can feel it before they even know who they are looking at. The photographers immediately pivoted their lenses toward us. They did not recognize Andre by face, as he strictly kept his identity scrubbed from the internet. But the sheer, unshakable authority radiating from him commanded instant respect. The flashbulbs blinded us as we walked arm in arm up the grand staircase. We bypassed the standard check-in line and moved through the heavy brass doors into the grand foyer. The interior of the estate was dripping in desperate excess. Towering ice sculptures of the Titan Logistics logo dominated the center of the room. Waiters in white gloves circulated with silver trays, loaded with imported caviar and vintage champagne. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive floral arrangements. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hand resting lightly on Andre's forearm. We navigated the crowded room with effortless grace, ignoring the curious whispers of the corporate elites who wondered who the stunning new power couple was. We did not make it 20 feet before the inevitable interception occurred. Jasmine stood near the entrance of the main ballroom holding a crystal flute of champagne. She was wearing a loud, heavily sequined designer gown that screamed for attention, clinging tightly to Preston's arm. Her eyes scanned the crowd likely searching for wealthy wives to network with. Then her gaze locked onto me. For a fraction of a second, absolute shock wiped her face blank. She took in my emerald gown, the diamonds at my ears, and the tailored perfection of Andre's tuxedo. Her brain short-circuited. She had convinced herself that we were currently living in a roach-infested motel, starving and desperate. Seeing me look more expensive, more polished, and more powerful than she ever could completely shattered her reality. The shock instantly morphed into an ugly, contorted fury. Jasmine slammed her champagne glass onto a passing waiter's tray and marched directly toward us, her heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. Preston trailed right behind her, his arrogant smirk returning the moment he recognized us. "What are you doing here?" Jasmine hissed, her voice shrill and loud enough to draw the attention of several nearby investors. "We received an invitation," I replied smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. "Vivian sent it herself. She mentioned something about wanting us to see what real success looks like. So here we are." Jasmine let out a harsh, mocking laugh, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "You are delusional, Kiara. Mom sent that to your old address as a joke to remind you of what you lost. You are not on the guest list. You have no money, no status, and absolutely no right to be standing in this room. You are uninvited crashers." Preston stepped up beside her, puffing out his chest. He looked Andre up and down, clearly trying to find a flaw in the bespoke tuxedo, but failing miserably. "Did you rent that suit, teacher?" Preston sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You must have emptied out your entire community center salary just to pretend you belong in our tax bracket for one night. Turn around and walk out the front door before we have you publicly thrown onto the curb." I did not flinch. Andre simply smiled, his dark eyes locking onto Preston with that same chilling, predatory amusement he displayed at the steakhouse. "We are not leaving," Andre stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that carried absolute finality. Jasmine's face turned a deep, blotchy red. She was furious that her high school bullying tactics were failing to intimidate us. She spun around and frantically waved her hand in the air, signaling the event security team stationed near the ballroom entrance. "Security!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the grand foyer. "Security, get over here immediately. We have trespassers." A massive, broad-shouldered man, wearing a dark suit and a discreet earpiece, immediately broke away from the entrance. He was the head of security for the estate, a man whose entire job was to physically remove unwanted liabilities from high society events without causing a scene. He marched toward us with heavy, purposeful steps, his face set in a stern, uncompromising scowl. Two subordinate guards flanked him, ready to physically drag us out of the building. Jasmine smiled triumphantly, stepping back to give the guards room to work. "Throw them out on the street where they belong," Jasmine commanded, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "And check their pockets on the way out. They probably tried to steal the silverware." Preston chuckled, adjusting his luxury watch, eagerly anticipating the physical humiliation of my husband. The head of security reached our group. He raised his large hand, opening his mouth to issue a swift professional threat of removal. He stepped within 5 feet of us, squaring his shoulders to block our path. Then the security chief made direct eye contact with Andre. The transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The blood completely drained from the massive security chief's face. His stern scowl vanished, replaced by an expression of profound, unadulterated shock. His hand, which had been raised to grab Andre's shoulder, dropped limply to his side. He recognized the man standing in front of him. He recognized the ghost CEO of Apex Vanguard Partners, the venture capital titan whose shadow companies literally owned the security firm contracted for the venue tonight. The head of security stopped dead in his tracks. He swallowed hard, visibly trembling as he realized he had just been ordered to physically assault the most powerful man in the city. Without a single word, the head of security snapped his posture into rigid, military, perfect alignment. He bowed his head deeply, offering a gesture of absolute total submission. He quickly stepped aside, physically shoving his own subordinate guards out of the way to clear a wide, unobstructed path for us. "Mr. Kingston," the security chief said, his voice shaking with deep respect and fear. "Madam, please forgive the interruption. Right this way. The VIP tables are ready for you." The entire foyer went dead silent. The surrounding guests, who had paused their networking to watch the drama unfold, stared in absolute bewilderment. Jasmine's jaw literally unhinged. She stared at the bowing security guard, then at Andre and back to the guard. Her brain could not process the data. "What are you doing?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking in pure panic. "I told you to throw them out. He is just a broke teacher. Grab him." The head of security did not even look at my sister. He kept his head bowed toward Andre, treating Jasmine like a noisy, irrelevant insect buzzing in the background. Preston stood entirely frozen. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization that he had drastically, fatally miscalculated the dynamic of power in the room. I looked at my sister, whose perfect smug facade had just been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat. I simply offered her a cold, brilliant smile. "Keep practicing that authoritative tone, Jasmine," I said smoothly, my voice carrying effortlessly over the silent crowd. "You are going to need it when you are begging for a job tomorrow morning." I tightened my grip on Andre's arm. We stepped past my paralyzed sister and her silent husband, gliding gracefully through the path the security chief had cleared for us. We walked directly through the heavy brass doors and into the main ballroom, leaving Jasmine gasping for air in the foyer, completely powerless and entirely obsolete. Jasmine was still struggling to process the reality of our entrance as we left her behind in the grand foyer. I could hear her frantic, panicked voice trailing off, demanding that someone explain what was happening. We did not look back. We stepped through the heavy brass doors and entered the main ballroom. The space was a masterpiece of corporate excess designed specifically to overwhelm the senses. Towering floral centerpieces dominated dozens of tables covered in crisp white linen. The room buzzed with the low electric hum of Atlanta's most powerful investors, politicians, and media personalities. At the far end of the room, an elevated stage was bathed in brilliant spotlights flanked by two massive digital screens displaying the Titan Logistics logo. We moved quietly through the crowd, locating the VIP table, reserved for the Vanguard Executive Board, right at the front. The table was currently empty, waiting for the proxy board Reginald expected to arrive. We took our seats, sitting perfectly still as the lights dimmed. The crowd quieted as Reginald stepped out from behind the velvet curtain and strode confidently to the center of the stage. He wore a custom-tailored tuxedo and a smile of absolute, unshakable arrogance. He looked like a man who believed he had just conquered the world. The audience erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Reginald raised a hand, soaking in the adulation for a long moment before stepping up to the microphone. He began his speech with a masterclass in corporate narcissism. He spoke about his humble beginnings, spinning a narrative of relentless hard work and unmatched business acumen. He bragged about the legacy he had built, the empire he had forged with his own bare hands. He did not mention the $400 million in short-term debt. He did not mention the operational deficits or the fact that his company was days away from total bankruptcy. He sold the crowd a perfect, flawless illusion. Titan Logistics has always been at the forefront of global innovation. Reginald boomed, his voice echoing off the ballroom walls. But true leadership requires the vision to recognize when it is time to evolve. We are not just surviving in this market, we are dominating it. He paused, looking out over the crowd, his chest puffed out with pride. "Tonight, we are here to celebrate the dawn of a new era," Reginald announced. "I am incredibly proud to confirm that Titan Logistics has entered into a strategic acquisition agreement with one of the most powerful venture capital firms in the world. This merger will secure our legacy for generations to come." The crowd applauded again. Reginald smiled, gesturing toward the empty VIP table where we sat in the shadows. "We are honored to have the leadership of Apex Vanguard Partners here with us tonight," Reginald continued, his voice dripping with triumphant anticipation. "I would like to invite the Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard to the stage to say a few words about our incredible new partnership." Reginald stepped back, gesturing grandly toward the stage stairs. He expected a corporate proxy to walk out. He expected a polished, anonymous lawyer in a gray suit to step up and validate his lies to the media. Andre stood up. He buttoned his bespoke tuxedo jacket with a calm, precise movement. He did not rush. He walked past the VIP tables, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of an apex predator. He climbed the short flight of stairs and stepped directly into the brilliant glare of the stage spotlights. The silence that fell over the ballroom was immediate and absolute. It was the kind of silence that sucks the oxygen out of the air. Reginald froze. His hand, which had been raised to welcome the Vanguard CEO, remained suspended mid-air. The triumphant smile on his face shattered instantly, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. He stared at Andre, his brain completely unable to process the data his eyes were receiving. At the family VIP table situated just left of the stage, Preston had a crystal flute of champagne halfway to his mouth. He choked. The expensive wine sprayed across the white tablecloth as he coughed violently, his face turning a deep, sickly red. Jasmine, who had just managed to find her seat after the disaster in the foyer, stared at the stage with her mouth hanging wide open. Vivian sat perfectly still, her hands trembling so violently that her diamond bracelets clattered against the table. Andre walked straight to the center of the stage. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at Reginald. For a terrifying 5 seconds, neither man moved. Reginald opened his mouth trying to formulate a word, a question, an order to security. Nothing came out. His hands began to shake. The heavy gold-plated microphone slipped from his fingers and hit the stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of feedback that made the front row wince. Andre calmly reached down and picked up the microphone. He stood tall, the spotlights reflecting off his dark eyes, and turned his attention to the silent, breathless ballroom. "Good evening," Andre said, his deep, resonant voice echoing through the massive space. "My name is Andre Kingston. I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Vanguard Partners." A low murmur rippled through the crowd of investors. They were witnessing history. The ghost CEO of Vanguard had finally revealed himself. "I want to thank Reginald for his passionate speech." Andre continued, his tone perfectly smooth and dangerously polite. He spoke eloquently about the importance of vision and the necessity of evaluating a company's true worth. At Vanguard, we share that philosophy. We believe in executing rigorous, uncompromising due diligence before committing our capital to any venture. Reginald took a step backward, his face draining of all color. He looked like a man standing on the trapdoor of a gallows watching the executioner pull the lever. "When we evaluate a potential acquisition," Andre said, pacing slowly across the stage, "we look past the public relations, we look past the speeches, we look directly at the foundation, because an empire built on hidden debt and toxic leadership is not an empire at all, it is a liability." Andre stopped pacing. He turned back to Reginald, his gaze locking onto my father with devastating intensity. "And Vanguard," Andre stated, his voice dropping into a cold, lethal register, "does not invest in liabilities." Andre spoke, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. He did not raise his tone, nor did he display a single ounce of malice. He sounded exactly like what he was, a venture capitalist delivering a fatal assessment. "Titan Logistics approached Vanguard seeking an immediate buyout," Andre stated, projecting his voice effortlessly to the back of the room. "The terms proposed were aggressive, intended to finalize before the end of the fiscal quarter. As part of our standard due diligence, we analyzed the internal operational metrics of Titan Logistics independent of their public SEC filings." He paused. The investors in the room, seasoned corporate predators themselves, immediately recognized the shift in language. The atmosphere changed from a celebratory gala to a boardroom tribunal. "We discovered severe discrepancies," Andre continued. "Titan Logistics is currently operating with over $400 million in high-interest short-term debt. Their primary distribution hubs are running at a 20% deficit due to mismanagement and stalled labor negotiations. The company is not dominating the market as previously stated. It is actively hemorrhaging capital." A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. The board of directors sitting at the VIP tables shot out of their seats. The financial press stationed at the back frantically began typing on their phones and tablets. The news was already leaking to the markets. Reginald's face contorted into a mask of sheer panic. He lunged toward Andre, his arms outstretched, desperately trying to grab the microphone back. "Lies!" Reginald screamed, his voice raw and cracking. "This is slander security. Get this man off the stage." The head of security, standing at the edge of the stage, did not move a single muscle. He stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind his back, staring straight ahead. He worked for Vanguard, not Titan Logistics. Andre smoothly sidestepped Reginald's frantic lunge. He raised his free hand, signaling the tech team operating the ballroom's audiovisual system. "Vanguard Partners does not deal in slander," Andre announced, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "We deal in data, and we do not invest in liabilities." The massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered. The Titan Logistics logo vanished. In its place, stark, undeniable financial spreadsheets illuminated the ballroom. The screens displayed the hidden debt ledgers, the plummeting operational margins, and the desperate pleading emails Reginald's legal team had sent to Vanguard's proxy board just 3 days ago. The evidence was monumental and irrefutable. The investors in the room stared at the screens in horror. Reginald had brought them all here under false pretenses, hoping to use the gala to boost his stock price before the inevitable collapse. Andre had just ripped the veil away, exposing the rot underneath. Reginald staggered backward, his eyes fixed on the screens. He clutched his chest, gasping for air. The arrogant titan of industry was gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man realizing his empire had just been incinerated in front of the entire city. At the family table, the devastation was total. Preston was furiously scrolling through his phone, likely watching his own hedge fund's investments in Titan Logistics plummet in real time. Jasmine was hyperventilating, her hands clawing at her sequined dress. Vivian sat completely paralyzed, her eyes wide, unable to comprehend that the wealth and status she worshipped had just evaporated. This was the moment. I stepped away from the VIP table. I did not run. I walked with slow, deliberate precision. My emerald gown caught the light as I ascended the short flight of stairs to the stage. I moved past my father, who was leaning heavily against the podium, staring at the floor in absolute defeat. I stopped beside Andre. He looked at me, a profound, unshakable pride in his eyes. He gently handed me the microphone. I turned my back on the crowd. I turned my back on the investors, the press, and the board of directors. They did not matter. This was not about them. I looked down at the family VIP table. I locked eyes directly with my mother. Vivian stared back at me, her face pale, her perfect image-obsessed facade completely shattered. The woman who had evicted me, who had thrown my clothes in a garbage bag, who had gaslit me and degraded me for 35 years, looked up at me with sheer, unadulterated terror. I held the microphone to my lips. My voice did not shake. It rang clear, sharp, and absolutely lethal. "I believe you said I was the family failure," I asked, the words slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. I let the question hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the final devastating blow. "Check your stock prices, Mother." I turned off the microphone. The soft click echoed like a gunshot. I handed the mic back to Andre. He took my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. We turned away from the destruction, walked down the stairs, and glided straight through the panicked, chaotic crowd, leaving my family to drown in the ruin they had built for themselves. We did not rush toward the exit. We moved with the slow, deliberate pace of victors, leaving a conquered battlefield. The sea of wealthy investors and corporate elites parted for us automatically. No one dared to make eye contact with Andre, and no one dared to speak a word to me. The power dynamic in the room had shifted with such violent force that the sheer shockwave of it left the entire crowd paralyzed. Before we reached the grand brass doors of the foyer, I paused. I stopped on the elevated marble landing and turned back to look at the ballroom floor. Andre stood quietly beside me, his hand resting at the small of my back, allowing me the time to witness the exact outcome I had engineered. It was a masterclass in corporate cannibalism, and I refused to miss a single second of it. My father did not even have the opportunity to step off the stage before his own board of directors surrounded him. These were ruthless, deeply pragmatic men and women who cared absolutely nothing about Reginald or his carefully curated image of black excellence. They cared about their stock portfolios and their own legal liabilities. Chairman Winston, a towering man who had just praised my father 20 minutes prior, led the charge. He marched directly up the stage steps, cutting off my father's escape route. Even from the elevated landing, I could hear the sheer volume of Winston shouting. He pointed a rigid finger squarely at my father's chest, demanding immediate answers for the $400 million in hidden debt glaring at them from the massive digital screens. Reginald tried to fall back on his usual tactics. I watched him puff out his chest and wave his hands, attempting to project authority and gaslight his own board of directors. He yelled that the data was fabricated, that it was a personal attack from a disgruntled daughter. But the board members were not his obedient wife or his conditioned children. They were financial predators, and they could read the undeniable SEC-level supply chain data staring right back at them. Winston did not wait for a formal boardroom meeting. He did not wait for legal counsel to draft termination papers. Right there in front of the flashing cameras of the financial press, Winston called an emergency proxy vote. The other board members crowding the stage raised their hands in immediate unanimous agreement. In less than 3 minutes, Reginald was stripped of his title. He was officially ousted as the chief executive officer of the logistics empire he had spent his entire life building. I watched as the Vanguard security team, the very men my father had hired to protect his gala, smoothly stepped forward and confiscated Reginald's corporate phone and his administrative access badges. They stripped him naked in the corporate sense right in front of the entire city of Atlanta. Reginald stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, a deposed king standing in the ruins of his own castle. But my father was not the only casualty of the night. My attention shifted to the VIP table, where my sister Jasmine and her arrogant husband Preston were experiencing their own rapid unraveling. Preston was clutching his phone to his ear, his face drained of all color. His family managed a multi-billion-dollar generational hedge fund. They survived by maintaining a pristine, untouchable reputation in the financial sector. The news of Titan Logistics hiding massive debt and operating on the brink of bankruptcy was already hitting the market feeds. Preston was married to the daughter of a man who was about to be investigated for massive corporate fraud. In the high-stakes world of old money wealth, that kind of association is an absolute infection. I watched Preston's body language collapse. His shoulders slumped, and his arrogant posture completely vanished. His father was on the other end of that phone call, executing a swift and brutal amputation to protect their main portfolio. The hedge fund was completely severing ties with Titan Logistics, and by extension, they were severing ties with Preston to insulate their assets from the impending SEC fallout. Preston dropped his phone onto the white linen tablecloth. He looked like a man who had just been shoved out of an airplane without a parachute. Jasmine, completely oblivious to the mechanics of the financial slaughter happening around her, reached out to grab Preston's arm. She tried to play the role of the dutiful, supportive wife, whispering frantically to him. She expected him to protect her. She expected his white privilege and his family wealth to act as a shield against the disaster my father had just caused. Preston violently yanked his arm away from her grasp. He spun around and shouted directly in her face, pointing an accusatory finger at her, and then at my father on the stage. He blamed her. Jasmine Golden Child's status was entirely dependent on her proximity to wealth and power. She had spent her whole life strictly following our parents' playbook, believing that marrying a rich man guaranteed her safety. In a matter of minutes, that entire safety net was incinerated. Preston grabbed his suit jacket and stormed away from the table, leaving his wife sitting entirely alone in the chaos. Panic finally set in on Jasmine's face. She grabbed her designer purse and frantically pulled out her phone, opening her banking applications. She retrieved her platinum credit cards, tapping the screen with shaking fingers. Her family was cut off. Her husband was disinherited. I watched her perfectly manicured hands tremble as the screens loaded, confirming the absolute worst. The accounts were freezing in real time. Jasmine looked up from her phone, her eyes wide and terrified, scanning the room wildly until her gaze met mine on the elevated landing. She looked at me, the sister she had mocked, the sister she had tried to evict, the sister she had called the family failure just hours prior. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated desperation, hoping for a lifeline. I did not offer her a sad smile. I did not offer her a look of pity. I simply maintained a cold, blank expression, matching the exact same energy she had given me when she dropped my clothes in a garbage bag at my feet. She made her choices, and now she had to live in the reality she helped create. I turned my back on the ballroom. Andre gently rested his hand on my shoulder, and we walked through the grand foyer together. The humid Atlanta night air washed over us as we stepped outside. The Maybach was already waiting at the bottom of the red carpet, the engine purring softly. We climbed into the quiet, luxurious cabin, and the heavy doors sealed shut. The chaos, the screaming, the financial ruin, all of it faded away into the silence of the vehicle. I leaned my head against the rich leather seat and closed my eyes, letting the profound, undeniable weight of victory settle deep into my bones. Exactly 7 days passed since the gala. The financial sector moved with absolute ruthlessness, and the total dismantling of Titan Logistics was swift. The board of directors stripped my father of all his equity to cover the massive debts, and federal regulators were already circling the remains of his shattered empire. Andre and I were sitting in the penthouse having breakfast when the secure intercom system chimed. The private line connected directly to the head of building security down in the main lobby. I pressed the communication button, expecting a routine update about a package delivery. Instead, the security chief sounded unusually tense. He informed me that 3 individuals had managed to tailgate a resident vehicle through the subterranean security gates. They were currently standing in the pristine marble lobby, crying hysterically and demanding to speak with me. It was Reginald, Vivian, and Jasmine. They had come to beg. Andre stood up immediately, his protective instincts flaring, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. I told him that I needed to do this alone. This was the final thread connecting me to a lifetime of psychological abuse, and I needed to sever it myself. I did not change out of my comfortable silk loungewear. I did not put on makeup or armor myself in designer clothes. I did not need any of that anymore. My power was no longer tied to my appearance. I stepped onto the private glass elevator and descended to the ground floor. 2 massive Vanguard security operatives flanked me, standing with rigid military precision. The elevator doors glided open, revealing a scene that I would have found impossible to believe just a month ago. My family looked completely destroyed. Reginald, the once arrogant corporate titan, looked 10 years older. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and his face was gray with sheer exhaustion. Vivian, the image-obsessed matriarch, was a total mess. Her hair was unkempt, her designer mascara was smeared beneath her eyes, and the heavy diamond necklaces she usually wore were conspicuously absent, likely pawned to pay retainer fees for defense attorneys. Jasmine stood slightly behind them, shivering. She looked absolutely terrified. Preston had officially filed for divorce, completely abandoning her to protect his family hedge fund from the Titan Logistics scandal. Jasmine was entirely alone and completely destitute. The moment Vivian saw me step out of the elevator, she let out a loud, dramatic sob. She rushed forward, throwing her arms out as if she were going to embrace me. The 2 Vanguard security guards instantly stepped into her path, forming an impenetrable human wall. Vivian bounced off their solid frames and stumbled backward, clutching her chest in performative agony. "Kiara, please," Vivian cried out, tears streaming down her ruined makeup. "You have to help us. You have to talk to Andre. The banks have frozen everything. They are foreclosing on the house tomorrow morning. We have absolutely nothing left. We are your family, Kiara. We are your blood. You cannot just leave your own flesh and blood to starve on the streets." Reginald stepped forward, his voice trembling, lacking all the booming authority he used to wield. "Kiara, I am begging you. Just a small bridge loan. Just enough liquid capital to keep the federal regulators from filing criminal fraud charges against me. You are a financial strategist. You know how these things work. You can structure a bailout. Please, you are my daughter. I will do anything." I stood perfectly still, letting their pathetic, desperate pleas echo through the cavernous lobby. I looked at the 3 people who had spent 35 years actively trying to break my spirit. "Family," I said, my voice dropping into a cold, deadly calm. "You want to talk about blood? Blood is just biology, Vivian. It does not earn you loyalty, and it certainly does not earn you a bailout." I took a slow step forward, causing my parents to instinctively shrink back. "Where was this devotion to family when you publicly disowned me at my own wedding reception?" I asked, staring directly into my father's eyes. "Where was your paternal love when you changed the locks on my condo while I was on my honeymoon? Where was your maternal warmth, Vivian, when you told me I would always be a failure and urged me to divorce my husband so I could crawl back to you in submission?" Jasmine let out a loud, choked sob, covering her face with her hands. "Kiara, I am so sorry," Jasmine wept, her voice cracking. "Preston left me. I have $0 in my checking account. I do not even have a place to sleep tonight. Please, I am your sister." I shifted my gaze to Jasmine. The golden child was finally experiencing the exact reality she had gleefully wished upon me. "You stood in this exact same building a week ago, Jasmine," I reminded her, my tone absolutely merciless. "You dropped a cheap plastic garbage bag full of my clothes right at my feet. You laughed in my face and told me to enjoy my new impoverished lifestyle. You told me I was dead to this family. You made your bed. Now you get to sleep in it. I unclasped my small leather clutch. I reached inside and pulled out a single crumpled piece of paper currency. It was the exact $20 bill Preston had sneeringly flicked at Andre's chest. Andre had tipped the concierge with it, but David, the concierge, had respectfully returned it to us the next day, stating he wanted no part of that toxic money. I had kept it waiting for this exact moment. I held the crumpled $20 bill in the air, letting the bright green paper catch the lobby lights. I looked at my ruined parents and my sobbing sister. I dropped the bill. It fluttered slowly through the air and landed perfectly at Jasmine's feet. "Buy yourselves a hot meal on the bus ride home," I said, echoing Preston's exact words with flawless, lethal execution. "Atlanta transit can be rough this time of day, but I am sure you will get used to it." I turned my back on them, completely severing the final tie to my toxic past. I did not look back as my mother let out a loud, agonizing scream of despair. I did not look back as Reginald collapsed onto the marble floor weeping for his lost empire. I walked straight into the private glass elevator and pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. As the doors glided shut, sealing me inside, I heard the Vanguard security team physically grab my family and drag them out of the building. The elevator accelerated upward, carrying me back to my sanctuary in the sky. I took a deep, cleansing breath. The execution was complete. The past was dead. It was time to build the future. 3 years have passed since the doors of that private elevator closed on my former family. I did not spend those years lounging in the penthouse or playing the role of a quiet billionaire wife. I took the brilliant strategic mind my father had constantly undermined and put it to work. Andre had the capital, but I had the vision. Together we stepped away from the aggressive corporate acquisitions of Vanguard and launched Luminary Ventures. It was a massive venture capital fund dedicated specifically to backing Black female entrepreneurs. I wanted to find women who had the brilliance but lacked the backing. Women who were told they were not enough, just like I was. We did not just hand out checks. We built empires. I sat in strategy meetings reviewing pitch decks, analyzing supply chain models, and structuring market takeovers for women who had been ignored by traditional Wall Street gatekeepers. We turned modest local startups into national powerhouses. I poured every ounce of my financial expertise into these women, ensuring they never had to beg for a seat at a table because we were building a brand new table entirely. My name was no longer associated with the disgraced legacy of Titan Logistics. My name became synonymous with absolute, unshakable success. The industry learned very quickly that when Kiara Kingston entered a negotiation, she walked away with exactly what she wanted. Today I sit at the head of my own corporate boardroom table. The room is a stunning masterpiece of modern design, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a flawless panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. Across from me sit the founders of a revolutionary clean energy tech firm. They are three brilliant young Black women who just finished pitching their national expansion strategy. I look down at the financial projections resting on the polished mahogany table. The numbers are pristine. The strategy is bulletproof. They have accounted for market volatility, supply chain shifts, and long-term scalability. They are exactly the kind of leaders this industry needs. I pick up my heavy gold fountain pen. I do not hesitate. I sign my name on the bottom line, executing a $40 million funding round that will catapult their company to the top of the sector. The room erupts into genuine, joyful applause. Andre sits to my right, his eyes shining with that familiar deep well of pride. He does not speak for me. He does not interrupt or try to claim credit for the deal. He simply watches his wife command the room with the effortless authority of a true titan. I stand up and shake the hands of the new founders, welcoming them to the Luminary portfolio. The energy in the room is vibrant, collaborative, and fierce. It is the exact opposite of the cold, toxic environment I grew up in. There is no gaslighting here. There is no manipulation or conditional support. There is only mutual respect and the shared goal of breaking every single ceiling placed above us. After the meeting concludes and the room clears out, I walk over to the glass wall, looking out over the sprawling city. The afternoon sun casts a warm golden light over the skyscrapers. I trace the horizon line where the buildings meet the sky. My thoughts drift briefly to the past. I think about my father Reginald, who lost everything because his arrogance blinded him to his own failures. I think about my mother Vivian and my sister Jasmine, who built their entire identities on the illusion of superiority and ended up with absolutely nothing. They tried to bury me on my wedding day. They stripped me of my trust fund, locked me out of my home, and threw my belongings in a trash bag. They thought cutting off my inheritance would starve me into submission. They thought poverty would force me to crawl back to them and beg for mercy. What they did not realize was that they were not cutting my lifeline. They were severing the heavy, suffocating chains that had held me down my entire life. They pushed me out of a toxic cage and straight into my true destiny. For 35 years, I believed my value was tied to my ability to please people who were fundamentally incapable of loving me. I believed I had to shrink my personality, dim my intelligence, and swallow my pride to fit into their narrow, conditional world. I thought surviving their emotional abuse was a sign of loyalty. But standing here today, looking out over the empire, I built with my own mind and the unshakable partnership of a man who truly sees me, I finally understand the ultimate truth. My worth was never defined by their approval. It was never tied to their bank accounts or their fragile social status. My worth was defined by my own resilience, my own brilliance, and my own unshakable vision. My family threw me away because they thought I was a failure. They had absolutely no idea they were just clearing the path for a queen. The most powerful takeaway from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the approval of toxic people, even if they are your own family. When others try to diminish your value or cut you off to fit their narrow expectations, they aren't destroying you, they are simply severing the heavy chains that held you back. True empowerment comes from recognizing your own resilience and refusing to shrink your brilliance for anyone else's comfort. Sometimes, the most painful betrayals are the exact catalysts you need to stop begging for a seat at a poisoned table and start building your own. Share this story with someone who needs the courage to walk away from toxicity and claim their own unshakable